It is a matter of some controversy whether or not there is any epistemic justification to be had for those who affirm an indeterministic understanding of free will, as I have described it. This is controversial even among those who believe in indeterminism. For example, John Lemos, who is himself a libertarian, expresses pessimism about the prospect of justifying belief in a libertarian understanding of free will. He says, "It is my view that, in this point in time, we simply don't have sufficient experimental empirical evidence, nor sufficient metaphysical nor logical nor intuitive evidence to establish that libertarian free will exists." Similarly, Kevin Timpe, also a libertarian, says, "Most philosophers agree that whether or not determinism is true is a contingent matter. That is, determinism is neither necessarily true nor necessarily false. If this is so, whether or not determinism is true becomes an empirical matter to be discovered by investigating the way the world is, not through philosophical argumentation. Is the actual world deterministic? I do not know. During the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, most philosophers and scientists thought it was, but the contemporary scientific consensus seems to go the other way." Yet another libertarian, Randolph Clark, has the most gloomy comments of all, saying, "Perhaps the best that can be said for libertarianism here is that, given the demise of classical mechanics and electromagnetic theory, there is no good evidence that determinism is true. If our beliefs on the issue are to be, as I think they should be, guided by the evidence, then we will leave the question open whether we have what is characterized by any libertarian view. We will accept, then, that perhaps we never have more than one course of action open to us at any given time, and we never exercise any greater degree of active control than what can be characterized by a compatibilist account. If this is in fact so, then we have never actually possessed something that many of us thought we had, and something that we may reasonably value. Though not the end of the world, neither is that a matter of indifference." In this next portion of the video, I wish to respectfully disagree with Lemos, Timpe, Clark, and those who share this general pessimism. What follows is a modest abductive argument for the reality of indeterministic freedom. I shall begin by attempting to precisely define some key terms so that it is clear what I am and what I am not defending. After this, I shall give a brief overview of abductive reasoning. Next, I shall lay out my argument for indeterminism, which, if successful, will be sufficient to warrant belief in indeterministic freedom without having to do anything more than reflect upon the relations involved in everyday experience. Finally, I shall endeavor to anticipate and answer some potential objections to my argument. Indeterminism stands in contrast to determinism. Determinism can be roughly defined as follows: the thesis that all actions and events are determined by prior conditions. Determinism can be parsed out in a variety of ways, but it seems to me to essentially require that all actions and events stand in a causal or determination relation to one another, such that all subsequent actions and events are caused by prior actions and events. An imperfect and crude illustration of this idea might be a row of falling dominoes, where each domino in the chain is caused to fall by the prior domino. Obviously, I do not mean to suggest that determinists believe that human actions are no different than falling dominoes. But I think it is fair to say that they view human actions, like the chain of dominoes, as being causally or deterministically related to the conditions which precede them and which follow them. Perhaps one caveat is in order here. Determinists may want to leave open the possibility that the causal chain of history has a beginning, and that the first action or event, whatever that might have been, was itself not caused by prior conditions. If this caveat is accepted by the determinist, then we must modify our definition of determinism accordingly. This modified definition would understand determinism as the thesis that all actions and events, since the first action or event, are determined by prior conditions. To get a visual illustration to understand the basic thrust of what I am saying, we may envisage a cluster of dots extended horizontally and completely connected to each other for their entire length by short lines, forming a shape resembling a sideways tree. The horizontal structure here represents the flow of time. The dots represent each and every action and event which transpires within time. Finally, the short lines represent causal or deterministic relations which hold between earlier events and later events. Now, the indeterminist wants to deny the accuracy of this picture. The indeterminist affirms portions of it. He accepts all of the dots and some of the lines between them. He believes that some events, and perhaps some actions, are caused by prior events, but he denies that this is the case across the board. He sees some causal chains of events as causally unconnected to other causal chains of events. Some causal chains terminate in agents which are themselves not caused to act by anything. They are the uncaused first causes of their decisions. The causal connectedness of all actions and events seems to me to be the main disagreement between determinists and their indeterminist counterparts. Accordingly, we may roughly define indeterministic free will as follows. The thesis that in at least some cases, the conditions which precede a person's choice are insufficient to cause or determine that choice rather than another. Now, to adjudicate between determinism and indeterminism, I propose that we use abduction. Abduction, also known as inference to the best explanation, is one of our most commonly used forms of reasoning. We often rely on it without even consciously realizing that we are doing so. Consequently, much of what I say in this section may seem obvious and even unnecessary, but analyzing this familiar form of reasoning will prove useful. By sharpening our understanding of what makes an explanation the best explanation, it will become easier to see why I take indeterminism to be the best explanation of certain data points. Roughly, abductive reasoning accepts a set of evidence or data points and then posits several different possible explanations for why the evidence is as it is, as opposed to some other way. It then selects from among the different hypotheses the hypothesis which best explains that evidence. How is one to determine which explanation is the best explanation for any given body of evidence? Philosophers have proposed various criteria which, if fulfilled by one hypothesis and not others, helps to adjudicate among competing hypotheses. These criteria include explanatory power. An explanation is better if it explains more of the evidence. Parsimony. An explanation is better if it is more plausible given one's background beliefs. Simplicity. An explanation is better if it doesn't require you to posit the existence of other ad hoc entities, or does not require you to accept new beliefs which lack independent evidence. For the purposes of this video, we will primarily be concerned with the criterion of simplicity. Specifically, I want to contend that indeterminism is a simpler hypothesis than determinism, and this, in turn, makes it more likely to be true than determinism, assuming all other things stand equal between the two hypotheses. Perhaps someone might wonder why a simpler hypothesis is, in fact, a more probable explanation. Joshua Rasmussen responds to this concern as follows. The answer, the reason the simpler hypothesis is more internally probable, is that the simpler hypothesis includes less total information and so has fewer ways to go wrong. Consider the following example. Suppose that you leave a stack of 100 $1 bills on the table next to your bed. You leave the room and lock the door. Upon returning to your room, you discovered that the window is open and that the money is gone. One hypothesis, which explains the evidence, is that a single burglar has opened the window and stolen the entire stack of money. However, it is also possible that in the time that you were gone, 100 burglars independently broke in and each took only $1. Clearly, the hypothesis that there was only one burglar is simpler, and therefore, this hypothesis ought to be preferred. A fuller defense of the criterion of simplicity would require a video of its own, and such a task would take us far afield. Fortunately, This criterion is fairly uncontroversial among contemporary philosophers, and so I will assume it for the remainder of this argument. Having defined my terms and explained the criteria for a best explanation, I will now proceed to argue that indeterminism is the best explanation for all of the available data relevant to our choices. I begin with the observation that, when I reflect upon the possible choices which I consider making in any given situation, I am acquainted with open alternative possibilities or alternative options. But what exactly is an open alternative option? I shall be using the term in a technical sense, which I define as a possible state of affairs which, as far as one knows, one has it within their power to make actual. Importantly, I am referring here to epistemic possibility, that is, the sort of possibility which may be actual relative to what one knows. So, for example, relative to what I know, it is possible that it will rain tomorrow. Obviously, it either actually will rain or it actually will not. But when I deliberate over whether or not it will rain tomorrow, both are epistemically possible since, in this hypothetical, I have no access to what will actually happen. Similarly, when I deliberate over the actions which I will perform, for example, whether or not I will skip breakfast, both are epistemically possible since I have no access to what will actually happen. This is important because determinists generally agree that epistemic possibilities are real. As such, I avoid begging the question against determinism when I say that I am acquainted with open alternative possibilities. I am not presupposing a categorical ability to actualize any of them, only that I can actualize any of them as far as I know. These observations, drawn from reflection upon my own experience of acting, form the basis of a modest argument that I do indeed act in an indeterministic fashion. As Alfred Mele points out, Betty may experience her deliberation as aimed at settling which of two open options she will select, an experience seemingly relevant to her satisfying the indeterministic condition at issue. If the best explanation of Betty's experience of openness were that she is internally indeterministic, her having that experience would provide grounds for the judgment that she is internally indeterministic. Now, Mele goes on to explain that he does not believe that a good argument has yet been given for indeterminism being the best explanation of our experience of open options, but I think that I can provide such an argument. Observe that when I choose to actualize a given option, in addition to open alternative possibilities, I am also acquainted with the sufficient causal relation between myself and my actions. That is to say, I am the cause of my own actions. As Richard Swinburne says, I could not try to do any action, basic or non-basic, unless I believed at the time that my trying was causally influential. Now, the determinist should be able to agree with this, but he wants to add something further. He wishes to maintain that, in addition to me causing my actions, antecedent conditions prior to my choice in some way sufficiently determined me to choose as I did. The indeterminist denies such a sufficient deterministic link between the prior conditions and the choice. It is important to understand that determinism requires these deterministic relations to be real things, for otherwise there is not a sufficient explanation for how antecedent events determine subsequent events. As Richard Franklin explains, determinism, as a philosophical doctrine, extends to every aspect of all choices. It may, therefore, be defined as the denial of the occurrence of undetermined events such as the Libertarian asserts. That is, it is the assertion that every total situation is a sufficient condition for what follows it, that there is always some true proposition, even if unknown, which asserts or entails that whenever this X, then this Y. The account, which may fairly be called traditional, offers an analysis of causation containing three fundamental features. First, it assumes that both cause and effect are events. Secondly, the events must be in a temporal relation of immediate succession. Thirdly, the event which is the cause must be at least a sufficient condition for the effect. Doubtless Franklin goes too far when he says that the relations to which determinists are committed must be construed as causal relations. Many determinists prefer to think that the determination consists in something other than causation, but even so, there must be some sort of determining relation in virtue of which prior events cause our actions. But when I actually make decisions, it would seem that I am not aware of that relation which the determinist is claiming exists. The determinist, then, is adding something further to our ontology, namely a sufficient causal or deterministic relation between the antecedent conditions of my choice and my choice. But this adds unnecessary complexity to our ontology. Moreover, it adds it to a very high degree, since determinism entails that these deterministic relations hold prior to each and every human decision. But we are not acquainted with this sufficient causal relation, and consequently, one wonders what justification exists for supposing that it exists at all. By removing a good many of these determination relations from the picture, the indeterminist can offer a substantially simpler ontology than the determinist. Indeterminism thus entails the existence of fewer entities. Therefore, indeterminism is the simpler hypothesis. So, by inference to the best explanation, and assuming that all other things stand equal between determinism and indeterminism is intrinsically more likely to be true. As such, we are justified in believing that determinism is false unless and until determinists can bring some sort of arguments or evidence for the truth of determinism. As Thad Botham says, suppose that two theories, A and B, compete in accounting for a given range of intuitive data. Suppose also that they account for this data equally well. However, suppose that the number of theory A's conceptual primitives is less than the number of theory B's. All other things being equal, preferring theory A to theory B would seem most reasonable. Most philosophers assume this as a central assumption of doing metaphysics properly, for the additional posits of theory B do not explain or account for anything not already accounted for by the fewer posits of theory A. Thus, the additional posits of theory B should be deemed as merely putative posits and so eliminated from any adequate theory. So much the worse for a theory having merely putative posits. Having set forth a case for indeterminism, I will now endeavor to anticipate some possible objections. One such objection might be that the line of reasoning which leads us to indeterminism has absurdly skeptical consequences if taken too far. For example, if the goal is to have as few causal or deterministic relations as possible within one's ontology, then why not eliminate all of them? Why suppose that any events are caused or determined by preceding conditions? After all, saying that nothing is determined is even simpler than my view, which only says that decisions are undetermined, because, rather than eliminating some deterministic relations, it eliminates all of them. But this leads us to an implausible sort of Humean skepticism about causation, and since virtually no one wants to maintain that absolutely nothing is determined, perhaps we shouldn't be so zealous to remove deterministic relations from our ontology. In reply to this argument, I readily agree that I do not want to remove all or even most deterministic relations from our ontology just because that would be a simpler hypothesis. But why is that? Well, because I take it that I have good reasons for believing in most of them. For example, billiard balls never appear to move themselves across a pool table in an unmotivated fashion. They only ever appear to move across a pool table when they connect with another object. Moreover, they do so in ways which are correlated with the direction in which they are contacted, as well as the velocity at which they were contacted. So the best explanation for movement exclusively occurring under these specific conditions and with these suspicious correlations is that these conditions cause and determine the ball's movement. Similar arguments can be constructed to account for the movements of other non-agental objects. As O'Connor observes, I don't merely observe the movement of the hammer and then the movement of the nail. I perceive the hammers moving the nail. This apparent perception of causality could be mistaken, of course. Our experience cannot furnish the basis of a demonstrative proof. By the same token, our apparent perception of ordinary physical objects could also, in this epistemic sense, be mistaken. Yet few take that as a reason not to believe that we do perceive them. However, we are just not in that sort of situation when it comes to conscious beings like ourselves. Our decisions do not only occur when discernible antecedent conditions obtain, nor are our actions predictably correlated with their antecedent conditions. So the decisions of agents are very unlike the deterministic physical world of cause and effect. Obviously, that does not mean that the decisions of agents could not be determined as well. It just means that we don't have the same kind of reason to think that they are. As such, we have good reasons not to remove the deterministic relations associated with physical objects from our ontology, since we have good evidence supporting their existence. But when such evidence is not present, as is the case with the decisions of conscious agents, the principle of simplicity weighs against introducing deterministic relations unnecessarily. Therefore, the defender of my argument for indeterminism need not worry that this line of argument can be generalized to eliminate all deterministic relations from their ontology. It most certainly cannot.